webinar. So I welcome everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me. If you're having any technical challenges, please put something in the chat box and we've got people who can help you out. But for the most part, we'll just sort of keep rolling through things. And so welcome to our final Climate Innovation Fund Grant Program webinar in a series of 3 webinars that we have put on to describe our grant program and introduce you to the focus areas of the Climate Innovation Fund at Alberta Ecotrust. And this one is on decarbonization and renewable energy. My name is Mike Melross and I'm the Program Director for the Climate Innovation Fund at Alberta Ecotrust. And joined with me today is Jessica Lajoie and Stephanie Drozda, Program Specialists with the Climate Innovation Fund. As well, we're joined by Simon Irving, who's our Grant Program Manager. And he's going to make sure things are running seamlessly behind the scenes, but also helping answer your questions today about the grant program. As I mentioned, we are going to be recording the session. We've already started to record that, and we'll send out a copy of the slides afterwards, as well as a link to the recording. So if you happen to have questions as we go along, just because of the number of people we have on the call, we wouldn't be able to do a round table on those questions. So please use the chat function or the or the Q&A box, one of the two, and we will answer your questions as we go along to the best of our ability. We'll maybe highlight a couple of those as well so that we ensure that the information is disseminated to the whole group. And we're going to be kicking off today's webinar with an example of a project to get us thinking about the possibilities for reducing emissions through decarbonization. And then we're going to dive into the grant program guidelines. Before we begin though, this is the agenda that we have in front of us. I do want to take some time to do a land acknowledgement. So in this last year, we've spent working mostly remotely, all of us, and gathering through screens. So it's more important than ever to really remember and acknowledge the land and traditional territories that we're working from. Today I'm in Edmonton, and that's in Treaty 6 territory, and it is the traditional gathering place for a diverse set of Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, the Blackfoot, the Nakota Sioux, the Iroquois, the Dene, the Ojibwe, Saulteaux, and Inuit, and many others. The city of Edmonton is also home to Métis Nations of Alberta, Region 4. My other colleagues are joining from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nations of Alberta, Region 3. As we collectively engage in our work to support a low carbon future, I invite you to consider how we can learn from and honor the traditions and the people who were here before us, and also who may come after us. And we don't do this just to jump through some hoop. We want to action these things and actually integrate this into the way that we think and the way that we develop our programs and even grant programs like ours. As you'll see, there's a focus on equity and reconciliation as one of our criteria. So in order to foster collaboration today, we have set up a board through a platform called PADLET for you to virtually leave your business card. It's actually a really neat little tool. We're going to put the link in the chat box right now. And it's really a way to create networking opportunities through this virtual world. And if you can find that link to the Padlet board in the chat, once on the board, you will find a pink circle with a plus symbol. Simply click on that circle to add a post. You can complete the post with your information, organization name, email, and idea for a project. If you're open to finding possible project partners or collaborators, I encourage you to check this Padlet out through the session as well as before you leave. And I think some, really interesting connections have been made through this process, and it's certainly a great way for you to get to know other people that are on the call and hopefully advance some of the things that you're working on and find partners and collaborators in order to achieve your desired outcomes. The PADLET board will open during the webinar, and we will send out the link if you'd like to populate it with a project idea after the webinar as well. And it'll remain open until July 1st. So that's it for the introductory comments. I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie Drozda for a brief introduction to Alberta Ecotrust and the Climate Innovation Fund.
Thanks, Mike. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with our organization, Alberta Ecotrust was founded in 1991. We're an environmental charity that continues to be a critical source of funding and capacity building for the province's environmental nonprofit community. We became a Low Carbon Cities Canada Centre last year, and the establishment of the Climate Innovation Fund is a natural fit in Ecotrust's suite of programming. The Climate Innovation Fund delivers programming in Calgary and Edmonton with a $44 million one-time cash endowment provided by the federal government through a partnership with FCM. As an LC3 centre, we work collaboratively with other centres across Canada, with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and our local governments in Edmonton and Calgary. We take on a nimble accelerator role, complementing and advancing the leadership work undertaken by the municipalities. Our approach is evidence-based and data-driven. We focus on the major urban emission sources in Calgary and Edmonton, the building and transportation sectors. Both cities have a fairly similar emission profile, though Edmonton does have a slightly higher industrial footprint. We strive to educate, train, build capacity, and develop policy while convening partnerships and amplifying the work of other programming in our communities through our strategic projects and programming. We also have a direct investment arm, which focuses on financing, credit enhancement, and impact investing. And finally, we have our grant program, which is our focus today, where we are aiming to fund local climate mitigation projects in Edmonton and Calgary, covering a diverse range of activities from technology demonstration to collective impact and policy advancement. And so through our best practice research, and as we developed our program framework and took in stakeholder input, we identified these focus areas as our impact for climate solutions in our urban spaces. So each of our focus areas, building better, retrofitting wiser, moving mobility, decarbonization, and renewable energy, as well as our overarching focus area, has sub-priorities within it for 2021, and these where we'll be targeting our grant funding this year. So that's just a brief overview. We've spent some time talking about the first two. We have our decarbonization webinar today, and then you can find more details on these sub-priorities in our program guide on our website. So we'll be starting off today with a presentation of our case study. And so I'm just going to turn that back to Mike to introduce our featured speaker for today.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Just pulling that up again. Okay, the intention of our case studies is to provide some examples of projects and initiatives taking place in Alberta and beyond our borders as well that are helping to address urban emissions. Our grant program could be used to fund complete projects, a piece of a larger project, or to help catalyze a project in the early stage of development. So just keep that in mind when you hear the case study. You know, it's for inspiration. Some of the case studies we've shared are definitely aspirational in nature, but we do hope they can spark some ideas. With that, I am now pleased to introduce our featured speaker, Eric Jensen from the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. Since 2013, Eric has been an analyst with the Sustainable Technologies Evaluation Program, STEP, of the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, where he has been a scientific lead on pilot projects evaluating the performance of emerging low carbon technologies, focusing primarily on photovoltaics and heat pumps. Prior to STEP, Eric worked for Ecologics Heating Technologies, a small-scale manufacturer of innovative cold climate heat pumps. He is a certified measurement and verification professional and holds a Master's of Applied Science in Engineering Physics, a Swedish Magisterexamen. I think you're gonna have to say that again, Eric, and tell us what that is, in solar energy engineering, and a bachelor's degree in physics. And I'm gonna pass it off to Eric to lead us through this presentation.
Hey, hi everyone. I always throw the Swedish Magisterexamen in there just to keep everybody, the announcer, on his toes. So my name is Eric Jansen. I'm an analyst with the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. I was invited by Stephanie here and the Alberta Ecotrust Foundation to deliver this webinar on a project that we completed in 2019 that was funded primarily by the Atmospheric Fund, which is essentially the Toronto version of the Alberta Ecotrust Fund. Title of the presentation today is Evaluation of Ductless Air Source Heat Pump Retrofits in a Southern Ontario Townhome Complex. Next slide, please. So as Mike mentioned, the goal of today is less about presenting the particular technology that we did a pilot around. It's more about the process of building a project and trying to create impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So in that respect, we're going to be focusing on some of the takeaways and transferable lessons from our technology pilot. Maybe so a similar project could be run under the Alberta Ecotrust grant program. I'll give a bit of an introduction to my organization, the STEP program. I'll provide a bit of background on the Ontario MERB sector, as well as an brief introduction to heat pumps, discuss some of the project goals and rationale, as well as the importance of partnerships and funders. We'll talk about the results and then some of the communications and subsequent scale up that happened as a result. So this is my group, Sustainable Technologies Evaluation Program. We're a not-for-profit collaborative research initiative within the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. We do research that supports the uptake of emerging low carbon or clean technology in different fields, in building energy and renewables and smart grid as well. A typical project for us would be to take an underutilized technology, say it's a heat pump, put it in an actual building, measure how well it performs, gather some information on business case as well as the owner or occupant experience, and then try and use that information to help promote the uptake of the technology. And that's exactly the sort of pilot project that I'm here to talk about today. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background information. The jump off point for this work was some market analysis that was done by the Toronto Atmospheric Fund. They found that about a quarter of all Ontario multi-unit residential building units are heated with electric baseboards, and the remainder being heated with natural gas. Now this is a problem, the baseboards, particularly because it's very expensive. They're inefficient compared to other electric heating options. It constrains the grid, and that might impact the electrification of other sectors like transportation, as we're now more and more talking about EVs. And very importantly, these buildings often have no central cooling systems, or they might rely on inefficient window shaker air conditioners. This is an issue because as we look forward into climate change and the temperatures warm, having some sort of reliable cooling system is going to be more and more important for human health and safety rather than just comfort. So getting cooling in some of these buildings is a really important goal, as well as energy conservation. Now, Ontario has a relatively low carbon grid. Only 10% of our annual grid mix is from fossil fuel based resources. The remainder is nuclear and hydro, because we also phased out coal in 2010. And the situation's a little bit different in Alberta. And we saw that saving electricity, although it's not the biggest carbon impact, it's just such a large sector. So the carbon emissions come from the overall scale of the sector, with 25% of these buildings being heated with electricity, and also looking at this as a potential early inroad for energy efficient heating technology in general. If we can demonstrate it works in electric heated buildings where the business case might be better, then there's greater potential to achieve those similar results in gas heated buildings as well, where the greenhouse gas savings will be larger. So we looked at technologies, okay, how can we completely replace an electric baseboard heating system? We decided on piloting ductless multi-split air source heat pump systems. Trying to show that schematically on the right-hand side. You can see in the left image there, baseboards, we just have an electric baseboard heater in each room or zone of the house. That's pretty straightforward. In a ductless multi-split air source heat pump system, we have an outdoor condenser like we would with a normal air conditioning system. We have ductless indoor fan coils in each room or zone of the house. And then the whole thing is connected together with refrigerant piping that's typically run on the exterior of the building. If you look at the performance ratings for this technology, it suggests that really deep electricity savings ought to be possible on the scale of 2/3 of the total electricity consumption of the heating system. So that's quite a deep savings. And that's achieved because heat pumps in general are able to absorb heat energy that's available from the ambient air. I'm not going to get into the specifics of that. It's essentially the same technology that's in an air conditioner or a fridge, except it's just used for a heating application. And the magic of it is that it even works in really cold conditions. Even these units can operate down to -25 or even -30. So it's not just something for Southern Ontario, also useful in the Edmonton or Calgary context as well. So we saw this opportunity, a large energy conservation opportunity. We saw there is a technology that can be used to meet that opportunity. But there's various barriers, of course, as to why it's not more widely used. Two of the key ones that we were trying to address in our pilot was low experience level with heat pumps in general in an Ontario context. It's not the case across Canada. I think out in the East Coast, they have much more experience with heat pumps than us. And there's also no Canadian case studies that showed both the business case and other co-benefits. So you could imagine that if there's risk-averse building owners that have a functioning electric baseboard systems, they're going to need a pretty compelling argument to switch. And we didn't really have that at the time. So our project goals, we wanted to do heat pump retrofits of actual MERB units that are heated with electric baseboards. We wanted to, could you go back a slide for a second there?
Sorry about that. I'm not sure. It keeps jumping and I'm not even touching it. The computer has a mind of its own. There we go.
You might have
Apologies.
the lock timing setting on. But
oh, perhaps that's what it is.
That's okay. No worries. We wanted to use, so perform heat pump retrofits in an actual MERB. We wanted to use some sensors to monitor its performance and calculate savings. We wanted to document occupants and building manager experience with the technology, and then broadly communicate the results with the overarching aim of transforming the market to more energy efficient heating solution. Next slide, please. So in terms of project partnerships and funders, of course, funding agencies are extremely important for these sorts of projects. Primary funder for us was the Toronto Atmospheric Fund, which, as I said, is the Toronto version of the Alberta Ecotrust. We also received funding from the Bloom Clean Technology Centre, which is essentially funding available from the Ontario government, and had base funding available from different local municipalities. So I think the advantage of having multiple funding sources is that from the perspective of any individual funder, you're making their research dollars go further. Industry partnerships were also extremely important. Not only do they provide expertise, in our case, they also provided equipment donations. So we had heat pump manufacturers, Daikin and Mitsubishi, donate heat pumps for this work. Cricket Energy, they were an HVAC rental company. So this was, their interest was in a potential scale-up business opportunity. If the case study had positive results and they could build a business case around it, then they were interested in a potential rental business or for renting out these units rather than having building owners pay the full upfront cost. So that was important to embed right into the project itself. We also had the study site, of course, and also communications. Communications were important because these partners could be champions for the learnings that we got from the project and help to further disseminate the results. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we actually did, so we had a townhome complex. 6 townhouses were included in the study. We did 4 retrofits and then included 2 as baseline units that had monitoring but were not retrofit. They were pretty standard townhome units for this area. There's 2 stories with a basement, 2 to 3 bedrooms on the 2nd floor with the main floor living space, dining and kitchen. No central cooling, but they did frequently have window shaker air conditioners. So we deployed, depending on whether it was a 2 or a 3 bedroom unit, 3 and 4 head ductless multi-split. So that means there's 1 indoor fan coil for each bedroom and then 1 in the main living space. And we also deployed a wireless cellular energy and temperature data acquisition package so that we could dial in to the data being generated from those units at any point in time and keep track of what was going on. Showing an image in the bottom right there of one of the example retrofits. You can see the outdoor condenser, it's mounted on the wall. And then those white lines are casings for the refrigerant lines. That actually made for quite a straightforward retrofit because a lot of the work happened on the exterior of the unit. There was really no interior finish work that was required. In the case of the condensers on the back of the home, for the bedroom that was at the front, it actually ran through the ceiling in the basement and then came up the front of the building. So again, very minimally invasive retrofit for the tenants. So get to some results. So we performed interviews and surveys with the tenants. We kind of had a comprehensive analysis of it in our final reporting, but often it's best, I think, and most useful just to let the tenants speak for themselves. And here are some of the quotes that we gathered as a result of the study and the interviews. So in reference to the installation process, there were no issues. I work out of town, I'm gone in the morning. You guys come in and do what you have to do, and we're pretty much done by the time I came back, no issues. So from the tenant's perspective, minimally invasive retrofit, I think that's probably an important piece of information for a building manager or owner. Did you find that the heat pump had any issues providing sufficient heat to keep your unit comfortable? Referring to a cold snap that was down to -20. Tenant said it did more than enough. I didn't have to turn the fan up all the way up. So one of the common concerns around this technology is it really going to work that well in cold conditions? Well, there are cold climate variations that can continue to operate and provide heating even in extreme cold, and here's an example from that tenant. Some other quotes: if I had to continue paying for that electric baseboard heater, I would probably be shopping for another place to live next year because of high bills. So that's an important co-benefit, tenant retention. You're going to keep tenants longer if you give them a good heating and cooling system. Other quotes: it's nice and clean looking, there's no wires, it was quiet, you didn't even know it was on. Very happy to have received the retrofit. So this is all different kinds of information that can just overall help either an individual homeowner or a building manager just feel more comfortable with this technology. Okay, so energy cost and carbon results. We use the International Performance Measurement and Verification Protocol, or IPMVP, to calculate the energy savings. We found that electricity was reduced up to 32%. So that's the whole bill. That's not just the heating energy as a result of the retrofit. And very interestingly, the cooling energy was reduced by a factor of 5 compared to window shaker air conditioners. So that's much greater than the specs would have you believe. And I think that's a really important finding as well. Annual cost savings on the scale of $850 for Ontario prices at the time of the retrofit. But the upfront cost for the unit is up to $14,000. So despite having strong annual savings, without any rebate, this is not really going to have a compelling business case, and it's only going to start to pay back at the end of its useful lifetime. We found carbon reductions that are on the scale of 0.5 ton per year. That's for an Ontario context with the clean grid. If a similar retrofit was done in Alberta, the carbon result would be much greater. And like I said, we're also looking at the overall having an inroad for heat pumps generally to eventually displace gas heating. And this is a large sector. So a lot of the small emissions over a large sector can result in greater results overall. So we identified through this process, we went in with the mindset that, okay, we have to completely offset the electric baseboards. We ended up with a premium heat pump system. It provided a premium level of thermal comfort and the tenants loved it, but it also came at a premium cost. We think in this sort of application where a lower upfront cost would be really important, that a ductless mini split, which uses 1 indoor fan coil with 1 condenser, that was then used in conjunction with existing baseboards, for example, in the bedrooms, that would ultimately be a much more cost-effective retrofit solution. It would provide high efficiency cooling, and it would also be able to displace much, but not all of the baseboard load with something that's higher efficiency. So we think there is a technology out there that can have a better business case, and we identified it through this process. Communications, this is always going to be an important part of your projects. We formed a stakeholder advisory committee meeting. We had 2 to 3 meetings for each project in our TAF-funded series of projects. It provided not only insight and guidance as to how to go about running our project, but was also just an early route to be able to communicate our findings. We also produced a white paper and full project report that's available on our webpage. Social media was important. We provided the results and wrote a post on TAF's blog, and as well as LinkedIn articles and things of that nature. We published research articles in an industry journal and an academic journal as well. We presented our findings at an industry conference. We hosted an in-person symposia as part of the grant. 50 people from different backgrounds, engineers, architects, municipal folks attended. And we also had a webinar as well for those folks that couldn't make it in person. In terms of scaling up, so our project concluded in 2019. As I said, we found that the ductless multi-split technology would require a pretty strong rebate to have a good business case. So for that reason, we don't see broader scale up at this point in time, but we do see some level of scale up happening in social housing, where there's generally more public money available to do this sort of work. For example, Toronto Community Housing has recently installed 120 of these units in a larger pilot that they're conducting. We're also doing follow-up work, identify that there's lower cost options that might strike a better business case. We're exploring that as well, as other groups in Ontario are as well. And that's going to be relevant to privately owned buildings. So if we just kind of take a step back and look at this whole process, we started from some market analysis. It showed a clear conservation opportunity. And we also saw that the manufacturers already had a market-ready solution that was available. We identified that low experience and a lack of demonstration was a key barrier for this technology. And we sought to fill the data gaps through conducting our pilot. Those data gaps being both qualitative in terms of overall experience with the technology and quantitative in terms of what's the business case and what's the energy savings. We leveraged funding from different sources to make research dollars go further. We had industry partnerships on board that helped increase resources for the project and also provided a scale-up opportunity should the business case have been stronger. We found that the business case for this particular technology was not as good as expected, but we did find the tenant experience was overall very positive. So that was a good outcome. And we also identified a cost-effective alternative. We broadly communicated the results through many different channels. And we do see some level of subsequent scale-up that's now happening in social housing. And we're exploring follow-up pilots that could find lower cost solutions. Okay, so that's my talk today. I'm hoping that much of that could be transferable to similar pilot projects that could be funded via an Alberta Ecotrust grant. Thank you to Alberta Ecotrust for having me here today, and thanks to you all. I think there is a question section at the end of this if you have any questions for me, but if not, this is my contact information. We can connect via email or LinkedIn, whatever is convenient to you, and keep the conversation going. So good luck to all of you, and thanks for coming.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was a great presentation. We did actually have a few questions come in, and I think we have a couple of minutes. I think it'd be worth it if I could just verbalize them to you and if you could answer them. Definitely there is questions around its applicability in Edmonton's climate and Alberta's climate in comparison to Ontario. Specifically, can this research be applied to Alberta in this way? Greenhouse gas emission savings would be larger and technology is advanced and become more cost effective, particularly paired with improved insulation. And then I'm just going to ask one more question that's sort of aligned with that. You know, the difference between an air source heat pump, understanding that it's more efficient in warmer Canadian climates, but what about Edmonton's when comparing that to a ground source heat pump as well?
Yeah, so I think in terms of cold climate, the recent, the most up-to-date, most advanced heat pumps that you're going to find, cold climate air source heat pump, different manufacturers have different names. Mitsubishi calls it hyperheat. Essentially, there's some modifications to the refrigerant circuit that allows it to operate down to minus 25, and I think as far as minus 30 these days. So yeah, I think that's going to cover the large majority of heating hours in Alberta. Mind you, as it gets colder, it's also going to get less efficient. So that's a consideration. I do think air source heat pumps definitely would be applicable in a cold climate like Edmonton or Calgary for sure. In terms of ground source heat pumps, of course, the benefit of a ground source heat pump, you're going to be dealing with deep ground temperatures. In Ontario, we normally say it's around 10 Celsius, which is going to be a much better reservoir for heat. But the difference between the two technologies is, yes, ground source heat pump is going to get you greater efficiency, but it's also going to have a higher upfront cost. What we see in Ontario, at least, is ground source heat pumps, very popular for large buildings and outside of the natural gas network. If we're talking about having to compete with low-cost natural gas, then it's often the air source heat pump that might provide a compelling business case if we're talking about especially smaller buildings that are within the natural gas network. So I hope that answered the question.
Okay, thank you. The next question, I think you sort of answered, but it is interesting. I think in your particular project, I think I saw a slide you answering this, but did you completely remove the baseboards or leave them in for backup? And maybe you can just explain I guess you had a conclusion that maybe that was a good idea to do, but.
We did not completely remove the baseboards. So we actually tested two variants, a non-cold climate and a cold climate version. So the non-cold climate version is only going to be able to operate down to minus 15. Now in Ontario, that's going to happen, like you're going to get colder than minus 15 like a few percentage of the time, but it's still going to happen. We wanted to try and come up with an intelligent way of, well, how can we integrate the baseboards with the heat pumps? The problem is that it's distributed. Each baseboard had its own thermostat, and we had multiple heat pumps kind of that were also regulated by their own thermostat. There was some technology available from the manufacturers to do all that wirelessly, but then it just ultimately became too expensive. So for the non-cold climate versions with the baseboards acting as backup, we ultimately just let the baseboards be thermostats be, I think, a degree or to a degree and a half below the heat pump thermostats. That's kind of the dumb way to do it. It's not ideal because they could end up fighting each other. But in our case, it actually worked out okay. In terms of the non-cold climate versions, the cold climate versions, it wasn't required. We did leave them in place, but they were never operated.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Eric. Those were the questions people had. But if people have additional questions, Eric's got his contact information up on this slide, and I think he's told us that he welcomes some additional follow-up from the group. So again, thank you so much. Very interesting, and definitely something that we need to keep our eye on here at the Climate Innovation Fund and how we can integrate this technology in Alberta.
Thank you.
So with that, though, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Jessica, who's going to talk about the next sort of decarbonization, the renewable energy sub-priorities, getting into our grant program details.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. So this focus area is, as you know, is called Decarbonization and Renewable Energy. And we've identified a couple sub-priorities to narrow down that large focus area for this grant round. The first is community and small-scale renewable energy systems and storage solutions. So I guess we were thinking, that batteries and things like that could come into play as well. And the second one is building level fuel switching and shared systems, which I think we had a great example from Eric just now on what that could entail. Next slide, please. So to give a bit more context about what types of projects could be eligible, for example, in the renewable energy systems sub-priority, things like policy studies that identify barriers and provide solutions for small-scale renewable energy. So that could be solar PV, other things that come to mind for people out there, but really looking at why some of these technologies. The technology is proven, but why aren't we seeing large scale uptake? What are the barriers? Definitely studies around that. As well, design feasibility studies for community generation and shared renewable energy systems. So this could be more of a program. How can people in a community come together and contribute to shared generation? How can those projects be self-sustaining going forward is something we're really interested in. As well, we are able to consider a capital contribution to battery technology deployment, as I mentioned, with that focus on how it will scale up or penetrate further in the market. And as well, like I said, models for financing community generation. So where can money come from and how can they be self-sustaining? So in terms of the building level fuel switching shared systems, yeah, heat pump research, again, capital contribution. So this is a pilot or demonstration project for heat pump deployment. Capital contribution to low carbon shared mechanical systems or district energy systems, again, with an eye to how these could be replicated throughout the communities of Edmonton and Calgary. Renewable PPA assistance, if you're not sure what that means, that's a power purchase agreement. So that's using the purchasing power of electricity buyers to encourage renewable energy in maybe in other areas, so not necessarily on site, but you can buy your electricity from somewhere else that's generating renewable power, and there can be quite a lot of uptake in that if the numbers are big enough. And capital contribution to building level carbon capture and storage. So this is something we've been looking into and are interested in. It could be very specific to a certain technology, and I think if we do get projects like this, they'll all be quite different. So I'm curious to hear what ideas people have around carbon capture and storage. And as well, filling knowledge gaps for using hydrogen as a fuel source. So this is something we're hearing a lot about, and there's many possibilities for hydrogen as a fuel source in our buildings and cities. So we're definitely keen to support research in that area. Great, next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the criteria for our grant program that requires greenhouse gas reductions. So a bit of background, if you're not familiar with how greenhouse gas reductions are calculated, typically we do a forecast or a scenario of what emissions projections look like out into the future. And what we're trying to do is intervene in some way with the project or with the research that we're funding that would change the trajectory of those emissions. So really, and then you can calculate, estimate a difference. It's definitely not an exact science, but you can estimate a difference of what would have been in the absence of the project or the policy or whatever is being studied, and what is the case actually after that project is completed. So applicants will need to demonstrate a change to that business as usual or trajectory that we're looking at, or the baseline activities. And the change in emissions after the project is what we will call the GHG emission reductions. So next slide, please. So how do we go about determining what that difference is? The reduction pathway for renewable energy projects is achieved by reducing the consumption of grid-powered electricity, which in Alberta, as Eric alluded to, comes from a mix of sources, including coal currently, as well as natural gas. So by increasing the renewable electricity production, we're decreasing the amount of grid energy required, which we can calculate the savings from there. And that will typically be for a typical solar PV project that's fairly straightforward. It'll be based on the size, the installed size of kilowatts for the project. Fuel switching projects will depend on the types of fuels in the baseline for different project scenarios, excuse me. So switching to electricity, for example, some people might say, well, you know, the grid electricity still has an emissions associated with it. Yes, it does. but often there's a huge added efficiency from electrifying a process, a heating process, I guess, in particular. And in that case, there is a delta between what natural gas consumption versus electrification, or whatever fuel source you're starting with. So we can calculate that as a GHG reduction. And as well, hydrogen, of course, too, would create a delta for a difference in projected greenhouse gas emissions and after the project. For carbon capture projects, as I mentioned, these will likely be very specific to the project. So we will expect that applicants coming to us with these types of projects would have done some work in trying to assess their greenhouse gas impact. And I encourage you, if you do have a project that you're looking at that involves carbon capture and utilization or storage, to please reach out to our Climate Innovation Fund grants team and discuss your project in particular and what you're using for your assumptions in that area. So in addition to looking at the greenhouse gas impact, as I mentioned previously, we're also really keen to be making systemic or wider changes. So catalyzing a project or a model that can be replicated. So this is what we're calling the scale. And we will definitely be helping applicants with this part of their greenhouse gas quantifications to say what is a reasonable assumption for how quickly or how much your technology or your idea could scale up. What we are looking for is help identifying the target market. So are you looking at residential single family homes? Is it multi-family homes? Is it businesses? Commercial buildings? There's a bunch of different areas that you could be tackling through this category. So putting some thought to where your solution could be widely applied will really help us get to that scale up and that market size answer. Great. Next slide. So a little bit more about how we do this. There are two types of GHG values that are estimated. And this will be something that we will do for each project. If the project has a direct emissions reduction, that will be calculated. So that means if it's a demonstration or a pilot where we're actually installing some technology that will reduce GHGs, that will be estimated. If any, meaning, of course, there might be a study or a research document being created, at which point there wouldn't necessarily be emissions from that type of project, but we still are keen to look at what the scale up would be. So we would calculate that on the broader scale. And so all projects will get a potential GHG calculation done. And if there's direct emissions, those will be calculated as well. So we are working on developing an estimating tool, user-friendly, that where we have already predetermined emission factors for things like grid electricity, natural gas combustion, things like that. We're looking at we've included the emissions inventories from both cities. So Calgary and Edmonton, as Stephanie presented earlier, have done a lot of work quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions within our cities. So we'll include that work, as well as any efficiency assumptions that need to be made. So we'll have all that in the background of our estimator tool that we're working feverishly to complete. And other considerations when we're thinking about projects are projects that reduce electricity or that impact electricity use. We are projecting that the grid in Alberta will get cleaner over time. So that means a reduction over year of how many greenhouse gases are impacted. Even if you're generating the same amount of renewable energy, the impact of that is less 10 years from now than it is this year, if that makes sense. And we are really trying to prioritize projects that can reduce greenhouse gases more quickly. We know we're on a very tight time frame to start impacting greenhouse gas emissions. So projects that can start in year 1 or 2 with reductions will be prioritized over something that might take many more years to ramp up. And currently, we're not doing full life cycle analysis for projects. We'll draw a boundary around the building or whatever is appropriate for the project. However, if there is a sense, or if we understand the project that there is a leakage of emissions, so they're being pushed off to another region or jurisdiction, or another place in the flow of energy and in the system, we will definitely have to look into that. So take that into consideration. For example, a hydrogen project, we would be very curious to know how that hydrogen is being generated, which I'm sure we've all thought about if we're proposing that. Great, we can move on to the next slide. Oh, I think we went backwards. Yes, so this is a quick example of how we are planning that GHG estimator tool that I talked about. So we'll have specific calculators for all our focus areas. So that's buildings and transportation, and then this more general decarbonization and renewable energy focus area. So we'll be looking to the applicants to provide some basic information about the project size, if there is an efficiency gain, some basic information that will be plugged into the tool. So the calculator can be made available. People can use that to generate these greenhouse gas quantification estimates. Or if you have a project that really doesn't fit, or that is very proprietary and has very specific pathway to GHG reduction, then we're happy to work with Alberta Ecotrust staff to work through that with you and come to a reasonable estimate of greenhouse gas emission reductions. And I added one more slide in, Stephanie, if you want to go to the next slide, just to give you, oh, I guess I didn't. Anyway, I had a slide just to kind of show you what we're looking at is to really project the tool will ultimately project what the emission reductions are over time, so that that we will be able to see over 20 years is typically what we're doing, the total cumulative greenhouse gas emission reductions. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Stephanie, and she's going to talk a bit more about the specific grant eligibility details.
Thanks, Jessica. So just getting into the eligibility details. So the eligible recipients for our grant program include qualified Canadian donees and nonprofit organizations. So this might include charities, community associations, industry business associations, First Nations undertaking projects within Edmonton and Calgary, school boards, post-secondary institutions, and the cities of Edmonton and Calgary. If there's any adjacent communities with the regional projects, if your project meets the project selection criteria, you can contact us directly to discuss eligibility. Ineligible sectors are private sectors or for-profits, individual schools or classroom-based programs, and political parties. For-profit and private entities can be eligible provided they partner with a charitable or nonprofit organization that would act as the lead proponent of the project. Eligible projects, so these have to result in direct project level and or projected greenhouse gas emissions reductions at scale over 20 years, as Jessica was speaking to. The activities have to occur in Edmonton and or Calgary. Projects will have to have a minimum of 20% matching funds. So you can have multiple sources of funding, including additional funding from the federal government. However, any federal government funds cannot contribute to that 20% matching component. And matching funds cannot come from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Non-cash contributions, such as salaries, can be used as matching funds, provided they are an auditable expense. Projects must align with the city's respective climate plans and or the goal of achieving carbon neutrality. As Jessica was talking about, projects should articulate a pathway to the scale-up of the initiative, and community benefits should be accrued in addition to emissions reductions, so benefits relating to the economy, social equity, and the environment. And project end date is a maximum of 24 months after the start date, but of course, proposals for shorter projects are also accepted. For ineligible projects, without kind of a direct or projected or enabling greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Anything that's broad public awareness or education, including K-12 classroom education. Projects, of course, can have an education component to them. It just can't be the sole focus. Redistributing the funds as grants or rebates, any marketing, surveying, polling, or advertising campaigns. The primary activity is just a one-off workshop or event. Any single one-off technology deployment, building retrofits, or projects without an approach to scaling up across the demographic or sector, and community gardens. So for 2021, these are the grant amounts that we have available in each city. So in Calgary, 425,000, and in Edmonton, just over 550,000. To calibrate the grant call, we're anticipating requests in the range of $10,000 to $50,000. We will accept applications for potential higher levels of funding if the project meets or exceeds the evaluation criteria across multiple categories with a high likelihood of scale up or replication. So we do encourage you to reach out to us to chat with us about your project if you do anticipate to have a project greater than 50,000. So for the timeline for the application and the process, our expression of interest portal will open on July 1st, which is just a couple weeks away. We do have the expression of interest questions in a PDF format on our website. So if you'd like to review those in advance of the portal opening, you can do so, but please remember that it has to, your expression of interest has to be submitted through the portal. So the deadline to submit your expression of interest is July 30th. And so expressions of interest that meet the eligibility criteria will be evaluated by Ecotrust staff using our criteria detailed on the website under the application scorecard. Based on this evaluation, a short list of applicants will be invited to submit a full application. So that will be happening in August. We'll be screening. Full applications will require additional project and budget information, and applicants will work directly with our team to quantify the project's greenhouse gas emissions reduction. An interview may be required at the full application stage. The final decision-making authority on full applications is delegated to a grant selection committee in each city who will evaluate the projects using our evaluation criteria. The grant selection committee is composed of representatives from the city's respective Climate Innovation Fund executive advisory committees and additional community members. Feedback will be offered to any unsuccessful applicants. You can get feedback on your project. And we do anticipate to have our funding decisions by the late fall, October, early November. So all projects have to meet some minimum requirements, and that includes you have to be an eligible recipient, as we talked about before, must leverage 20% non-federal funding, align with the city's climate plans and or the goal of achieving carbon neutrality, must fall within one of our CIF focus areas and sub-priorities, and the organizations that are part of the project have to demonstrate capacity in terms of staff and resources to complete the project successfully. So our evaluation criteria are available in detail on the website, but these are sort of the 4 buckets that we'll be evaluating. So the first is greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So this is direct reduction potential at the project level or at scale, and the weighting is the highest for this category. If a project has less direct emissions reduction, such as a study, we would look at calculating the reductions based on the potential if the project was in, or the study was implemented, and Jessica spoke a little bit more to that. The scale potential, so this involves the identification of the scale pathways that will be employed or integrated with an approach to widespread adoption, and the ability to replicate the project or concept and accelerate it up, and also avoiding carbon lock-in. The third is co-benefits. So this looks at benefits to the jobs, the local economy, social and community benefits. So does the project contribute to health or well-being of the community? Does it improve living conditions or health access, access to services, that sort of thing? And finally, other environmental benefits, such as promoting and protecting biodiversity, conserving habitat, reducing air pollution and that sort of thing. And then finally, equity. So looking at how a project considers equity dimensions relating to distributional, procedural, or recognitional equity. And there's more information on all of these criteria on our website. So that about wraps up the bulk of the webinar here. So we do have about 3 minutes left. I don't know if there's any unanswered questions at this point. I'll turn it over back to Mike to kind of wrap up for us.
Thank you, Stephanie. You know, there hasn't been a lot of questions in the Q&A. We have been answering a few of them as we go. One, I think that's worth pointing out to the group as a whole, because it is somewhat confusing. We do have separate funding for Calgary and for Edmonton, and we have separate grant selection committees for Calgary and for Edmonton. So if you have a project that might pertain to both cities, as just a logistical function of how we're funding these projects, you'll need to choose a lead city. You'll need to choose the city in which you're going to do the work. Certainly, I guess benefits could be accrued in that other city, but just note that it would be need to occur, the large amount of the activities and the benefit accruals will need to be in the city in which you apply in. A question came up, well, could you apply to both cities with the same project then? I suppose you could, and just note you would be then through 2 competitive processes, one in Calgary and one in Edmonton concurrently. And that would be how you would position that. A few other questions are coming up right now. What municipalities outside of Edmonton and Calgary? Unfortunately, as a function of our funding, again, our geographic boundaries are Calgary and Edmonton. So at this time, this funding is not available for municipalities outside of Edmonton and Calgary. Certainly Alberta Ecotrust other grant programs, though, are available province-wide. And we do hope to expand the Climate Innovation Fund at some point, but that's just not a reality right now. And that's just a function of our federal funding agreement. Regional projects that meet the project selection criteria should contact our grants team. Absolutely, contact our grants team. All of our contact information is up on this slide right now. Just remember, again, if it is a regional project, the vast majority of the benefits and the activities must occur within Edmonton and Calgary. Can there be some, spillover? And certainly those aren't islands. Yes, that can occur, and we anticipate that will occur at times, but just keep in mind, again, the geographic boundaries are largely the of Calgary and Edmonton. Okay, so I think we'll close it off there because we are out of time. I encourage you to take a look at the Padlet board yet again. If you want to see who's here, the link has been put into the chat. I want to thank Eric again very much. It was a great presentation and nice food for thought. Encourage you all to reach out with any additional questions that you might have. We'll also have a post-session survey that we'll send out to the participants here, as well as a copy of the slides and a recording of the session. This is our final session, but recordings of all our previous webinars are available, and please don't hesitate to reach out to us with questions about your application or just general questions about our programming. So thank you so much for attending, and have a good day.